I never imagined I'd find myself in such a frustrating and emotional situation. I'm a first-time mom, and my baby girl is just 3 months old. Naturally, I'm still adjusting to motherhood, figuring out how to keep her safe while navigating the challenges of family dynamics. Recently, though, something happened that left me questioning my instincts and the boundaries I've set for my family. Let me set the stage. My husband and I have a close relationship with his mom, my mother-in-law, and we usually try to spend the holidays with her. She's been supportive in many ways, and I've always appreciated her efforts. But her new husband, Bobby, is a different story. Bobby has been part of the family for about 7 years. While I wouldn't say he's a bad person, his inability to respect boundaries has always made me uneasy. The problem isn't just his behavior, but also how the rest of the family handles it. Whenever Bobby crosses a line, people shrug it off or excuse him, saying he doesn't know any better because of his age or health issues. This excuse feels hollow, given that he's in his 60s and more than capable of understanding when he's made someone uncomfortable. Over the years, I've tried to overlook his quirks for the sake of family harmony. But as a new mom, my patience is wearing thin, and my tolerance for boundary pushing is nearly non-existent. I thought I'd been handling things well, staying civil during family events and keeping my distance when needed. But a recent incident involving my baby has shaken me to my core, and now I'm struggling to figure out how to move forward without jeopardizing the safety and security of my child, or completely alienating my husband's family in the process. To understand why this situation has become so difficult, it's important to explain the family dynamics. My husband's mom, my mother-in-law, remarried about 7 years ago. That's when Bobby entered the picture. He's a man in his early 60s, and while I wouldn't describe him as malicious, he has a knack for making things uncomfortable. Bobby's personality is a mix of overfamiliarity and an utter disregard for social cues. He often says or does things that make others squirm, but instead of addressing his behavior, the family seems to sweep it under the rug. The common refrain is that Bobby doesn't know any better, or that it's just how he is. Personally, I find that frustrating. For a man in his 60s, it's hard to believe he doesn't understand basic boundaries. Instead, it feels like the family enables his behavior, refusing to hold him accountable. Even before having my daughter, Bobby made me uneasy. There have been plenty of smaller incidents over the years that contributed to this discomfort. Moments when I felt like my space, privacy, or preferences weren't respected. Still, I bit my tongue. My mother-in-law has been a wonderful support system for my husband and me, and I didn't want to create unnecessary tension. Then came my pregnancy, which heightened my awareness of these dynamics. As I prepared to bring a new life into the world, I became more attuned to the behavior of those around me. The last thing I wanted was for my child to grow up in an environment where boundaries were constantly crossed. While I hoped Bobby might soften with a baby in the picture, his tendency to overstep remained glaringly present. Despite my growing discomfort, I continued to attend family gatherings and tried to focus on the positives. I wanted to maintain peace for my husband's sake and out of gratitude for my mother-in-law's kindness. But beneath the surface, I was always on edge, anticipating the next moment when Bobby might push too far. Unfortunately, that moment came sooner than I expected, and it changed everything. Even before the recent events, my discomfort with Bobby wasn't a secret, at least to myself. Over the years, there have been countless small moments where his behavior left me feeling uneasy. It wasn't necessarily about any single instance, but more about the cumulative effect of his disregard for personal space and social norms. One memory that sticks with me is a family barbecue a couple of years ago. Bobby thought it would be funny to tease me in front of everyone about a personal preference I'd shared earlier in the day. It wasn't anything serious, just a casual comment I'd made about not liking a particular food, but he latched onto it and turned it into a running joke. Everyone laughed, and I felt obligated to laugh along, but inside I was mortified. It wasn't the teasing itself that bothered me. It was the fact that he didn't seem to notice or care how uncomfortable I was. Things like this happened frequently. Bobby often seemed oblivious to the feelings of those around him, brushing off any tension as harmless fun. And to be fair, no one else in the family seemed to mind. My husband would shrug it off, saying, "That's just Bobby," while my mother-in-law would smile and tell me not to take it personally. When I became pregnant, these feelings of unease intensified. I started noticing the little ways Bobby ignored boundaries, stepping too close during conversations, commenting on things he shouldn't, and always finding a way to make himself the center of attention. For the most part, I stayed quiet about my concerns. I didn't want to stir up drama, especially since the rest of the family seemed so content with Bobby's antics. But the truth is, I felt uneasy every time we were in the same room. I told myself I could manage it, that I just needed to keep my distance and avoid situations where he might overstep. But as the due date approached, and I thought about the kind of environment I wanted for my child, I couldn't shake the feeling that Bobby's behavior would eventually become a problem I couldn't ignore. I was right. The breaking point for me started before my baby was even born. My husband and I decided to send an email to our family about the vaccinations we wanted everyone to have before meeting our newborn. It was a straightforward request, and we approached it as kindly as possible, framing it as a joint decision for our baby's health and safety. My husband even took the lead in writing and sending the email, hoping it would make the request feel less personal or confrontational. For the most part, the responses were supportive or at least neutral, except for Bobby's. Out of nowhere, he sent me a scathing, emotional email. It was completely unhinged. He accused me of being controlling, selfish, and overly cautious. The tone was snide and accusatory, and it was clear that he had singled me out, even though my husband and I had presented the decision as a team. Bobby's words were dripping with resentment, and reading them left me shaking with frustration and disbelief. When I showed the email to my husband, he was furious. He immediately called his mom to let her know how inappropriate Bobby's response was. My mother-in-law, to her credit, apologized and tried to smooth things over, blaming Bobby's behavior on the hormonal medications he was taking for cancer treatment. While I sympathized with his health struggles, it felt like yet another excuse to justify behavior that was clearly out of line. Eventually, my husband confronted Bobby directly. After some back and forth, Bobby begrudgingly apologized, though it was half-hearted at best. Despite his aversion to the vaccines, he did end up getting them, which I appreciated. But the damage had already been done. At family gatherings, Bobby's resentment lingered. He would shoot me dirty looks and act wounded, as if I had wronged him by prioritizing my baby's health. The tension didn't just fade away with time. Instead, it simmered under the surface, making every interaction with Bobby feel like walking on eggshells. I tried to let it go for the sake of family harmony, but deep down, I knew this unresolved conflict was bound to resurface sooner or later. After the vaccine email incident, the family's reaction felt as frustrating as Bobby's outburst itself. My husband and I had been clear in our message. It wasn't a personal attack or a demand for control. It was about protecting our newborn, plain and simple. Yet somehow, Bobby's tantrum became the central issue, and I ended up being painted as the unreasonable one. My mother-in-law was the first to jump in, pleading with us to let it go. She explained that Bobby's reaction was due to the hormonal medications he was taking for his cancer treatment. While I understood her concern and sympathized with his health challenges, it didn't erase the fact that he'd singled me out and attacked me over a decision my husband and I made together. Other family members were quick to follow her lead. "He's just set in his ways," they said. "Don't take it personally. That's just Bobby." It felt like everyone was more focused on protecting his feelings than acknowledging how upsetting his behavior had been for me. Meanwhile, Bobby's apology, if you could call it that, didn't help much either. My husband had confronted him directly, demanding accountability, and Bobby finally mumbled something that vaguely resembled remorse. But his tone and body language told a different story. It was clear he didn't believe he'd done anything wrong. What made it worse was how the tension lingered afterward. Bobby didn't lash out again, but his attitude shifted into passive-aggressive mode. At every family gathering, he'd find subtle ways to make me uncomfortable, shooting me side-eyes, muttering under his breath, or avoiding me entirely. The whole situation left a bad taste in my mouth, but I stayed quiet, hoping time would smooth things over. Unfortunately, the unease only grew stronger. The tension between Bobby and me didn't dissipate after the vaccine incident. It just changed form. Instead of outright hostility, Bobby's behavior became subtler, but no less uncomfortable. Every family gathering felt like a test of my patience and resolve. Whenever we were in the same room, Bobby would act as though I didn't exist. He wouldn't address me directly, and if I spoke up in a group conversation, he'd either change the subject or pretend not to hear me. His passive-aggressive attitude was palpable, and while no one else seemed to notice or care, it made every interaction feel like walking on eggshells. There was one Thanksgiving where his disdain was particularly obvious. My husband and I arrived with a dish we'd prepared, and while everyone else complimented the effort, Bobby barely acknowledged it. Later, when I mentioned something about our baby preparations, he smirked and muttered something under his breath that I couldn't quite catch. I knew it was meant to dismiss or mock me, but I decided to let it slide. After all, I didn't want to escalate things in front of the family. For months, this was the dynamic. Bobby would throw me pointed looks or make offhand comments, and I would bite my tongue. I tried to focus on my relationship with my mother-in-law, who had been genuinely supportive during my pregnancy. I didn't want to jeopardize that bond by making a big deal out of Bobby's behavior. Still, it was exhausting. Every family visit left me emotionally drained. I'd spend days before the gatherings dreading what new way Bobby might find to make me feel unwelcome. I told myself I was doing it for the greater good, for my husband, for my mother-in-law, and eventually for my baby. But deep down, I started to question whether maintaining this fragile peace was really worth the toll it was taking on me. Little did I know, the breaking point was just around the corner. When Thanksgiving came around this year, I felt a mix of apprehension and determination. My husband and I had agreed to stop by my mother-in-law's house for a brief visit, just long enough to share some pie and enjoy a bit of holiday spirit. I love my mother-in-law, and she's always been helpful and kind, so I wanted to show my appreciation despite my growing unease about Bobby. Walking into their home, everything seemed normal at first. The house was cozy and festive, with a Christmas tree already up and decorations scattered throughout. Bobby, to my surprise, was unusually pleasant. He greeted us warmly, even smiling at me, which caught me off guard. After months of passive-aggressive tension, I wondered if maybe things were starting to shift. Perhaps he was trying to turn over a new leaf, or at least make an effort to be civil. I wanted to believe this change was genuine, so I lowered my guard a little. I held my baby close, letting her take in the lights on the tree while chatting with my mother-in-law. It felt nice, almost normal. Bobby lingered nearby, commenting on how adorable my daughter was. His demeanor seemed relaxed and cheerful, and for the first time in a long while, I started to feel at ease in his presence. But that ease was short-lived. In a matter of seconds, everything shifted. Without warning, as I stood by the tree, Bobby reached over and grabbed my baby right out of my arms. No permission, no asking, just a swift, unexpected movement that left me frozen in shock. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood there stunned, as Bobby cradled my daughter like nothing had happened. The moment Bobby snatched my baby out of my arms, it was as if time froze. 1 second I was holding my daughter, marveling at the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree, and the next, my arms were empty. It happened so quickly that I barely processed what was going on until it was too late. Bobby was standing there, holding my baby, smiling down at her like everything was completely normal. I was stunned. My brain raced, trying to figure out how to react. Part of me wanted to yell at him, demand he give her back immediately, but I felt paralyzed. There were so many layers to my shock. The blatant disregard for my personal boundaries, the intrusion on such an intimate moment, and the sheer audacity of it all. I looked around the room, hoping someone else had seen what just happened, but no one seemed to notice. It was just Bobby and me, standing by the tree. He started cooing at my baby, rocking her slightly as though nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, I felt a mix of anger, fear, and confusion bubbling inside me. Why would he think this was okay? Why didn't he ask? The longer he held her, the more I felt the panic rising in my chest. I wanted to act, to say something, but I was caught in the web of dynamics I'd been trying to navigate for months. How could I confront him without escalating things and causing a scene? After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, Bobby finally handed her back to me. The only reason he did so was because she'd soiled her diaper, and he didn't want to deal with it. As I held her close, relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of violation. I'd never felt so blindsided. That night, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind, wondering if I had failed my daughter by not acting more decisively. It wasn't until we got into the car that the full weight of the incident hit me. I broke down in tears, and my husband's reaction was one of pure fury. As soon as we got into the car and shut the doors, the emotions I'd been holding back came flooding out. I clutched my baby tightly, tears streaming down my face. My husband, who had been quiet up until that point, looked at me with alarm. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. I tried to explain, my words tumbling out between sobs. I told him how Bobby had grabbed our daughter without asking, how I'd been too stunned to react in the moment, and how helpless and blindsided I had felt. My husband's expression shifted from concern to anger as he pieced together what had happened. "He did what?" he said, his voice rising. The whole drive home, I couldn't stop crying. I felt a mix of guilt and frustration. Guilt for not acting faster, and frustration that Bobby had once again disregarded boundaries so blatantly. My husband tried to comfort me, but I could see he was struggling to contain his own anger. He kept shaking his head, muttering, "That's not okay. That's not okay." Once we got home and settled in, I still couldn't shake the unease. My husband decided to text his mom right away, explaining what had happened and how upset we were. Her response was measured, saying she understood why it was upsetting and that she would talk to Bobby. But for me, it wasn't enough. I needed more than understanding. I needed assurance that this wouldn't happen again. That night, as I held my baby close, I kept replaying the moment in my head. I couldn't sleep, consumed by the feeling that my instincts had been ignored and my trust violated. For the first time, I seriously considered not going back to my in-laws' home at all. After my husband sent the text to his mom explaining what had happened, I was anxious to hear her response. I hoped she would validate how wrong Bobby's actions were and offer a concrete solution to make sure it didn't happen again. When her reply finally came through, it was polite but frustratingly vague. She said she understood why we were upset and that she would talk to Bobby about it. Her response left me feeling unsatisfied. It was clear that she recognized something had gone wrong, but her tone didn't convey the seriousness of the situation to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that her approach was more about maintaining peace than addressing the underlying issue. There was no promise that boundaries would be enforced or acknowledgement of how deeply this had shaken me. My husband tried to reassure me, saying that his mom seemed to get it and that we should give her a chance to handle things. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. This wasn't the first time Bobby had overstepped boundaries, and each time, the family's response had been to downplay his actions or excuse them. I didn't trust that this time would be any different. Even as I wrestled with my emotions, I tried to put myself in my mother-in-law's shoes. I knew she loved her son and her granddaughter, and she probably didn't want to pick sides or create conflict within the family. But from my perspective, her reluctance to confront Bobby in a meaningful way only enabled his behavior. Her response confirmed what I'd already started to suspect. I couldn't rely on her to enforce the boundaries I needed to feel safe. If I wanted to protect my daughter, I'd have to take matters into my own hands. And that meant making some difficult decisions about whether we could continue visiting her home, especially with Bobby in the picture. For me, the stakes were just too high to let this slide. Still feeling unsettled after my mother-in-law's lukewarm response, I decided to reach out to my sister-in-law. I thought maybe she could offer a fresh perspective or at least some insight into how to handle the situation. After all, she knows Bobby well and might have a better idea of how to approach this without causing a full-blown family conflict. When I explained what had happened, her reaction was far from what I expected. Instead of sharing my outrage or validating my feelings, she immediately jumped to Bobby's defense. "He probably thought he was helping," she said casually. "You know how he is. He doesn't mean any harm." Her words hit me like a slap. Helping? How could snatching a baby out of someone's arms without asking be considered helpful? I tried to push back, explaining how uncomfortable and blindsided I'd felt, but she waved it off, saying, "You just need to tell him you didn't like it. He's not a mind reader." That suggestion only made me feel worse. After the vaccine blow-up and months of passive-aggressive behavior, the idea of confronting Bobby directly felt impossible. The family had already shown time and again that they would excuse his actions, so why would this time be any different? Besides, I wasn't convinced Bobby would even care. If he truly respected me or my boundaries, he wouldn't have grabbed my baby in the first place. By the end of our conversation, I felt more isolated than ever. It seemed like no one in the family understood, or wanted to understand, how serious this was for me. My sister-in-law's advice felt dismissive, almost like she was asking me to accommodate Bobby's behavior instead of addressing the real problem. It was clear I couldn't count on her support either. Amid all the mixed responses from his family, my husband's unwavering support became my anchor. From the moment I told him what had happened, he made it clear that he was on my side. He didn't try to downplay my feelings or excuse Bobby's behavior. Instead, he listened carefully, validated my emotions, and assured me that he would do whatever it took to make me and our daughter feel safe. I could see how much the situation hurt him. On one hand, he was furious at Bobby for what he'd done and deeply upset that his mom hadn't taken a stronger stance. On the other hand, this was his family, people he loved and cared for, and he didn't want to create a permanent rift. It was obvious that he was walking a tightrope, trying to balance his loyalty to them with his responsibility to protect his wife and child. Over the next few days, we had several long conversations about how to move forward. He made it clear that he fully supported me in whatever decision I made, whether that meant skipping family gatherings altogether or setting stricter boundaries. "Our daughter's safety comes first," he said firmly. "No one has the right to make you feel unsafe. Not Bobby, not anyone." At the same time, I could sense how torn he was. His family is incredibly important to him, and the thought of missing out on holiday traditions or causing a divide clearly weighed on him. I knew he didn't want to alienate his mom, especially since she had always been so supportive in other aspects of our lives. Still, he never let his own feelings overshadow mine. Instead, he focused on making sure I knew I wasn't alone in this. His willingness to stand by me, even at the risk of upsetting his family, gave me the strength to start considering what I truly needed to feel secure. It wasn't an easy decision to make, but knowing I had his full support made all the difference. As Christmas approached, the dread started creeping in. The idea of going back to my mother-in-law's house, knowing Bobby would be there, filled me with anxiety. Every time I thought about walking through that door, I pictured him grabbing my baby again or finding some other way to ignore our boundaries. I knew I couldn't go through another experience like Thanksgiving. At the same time, I felt torn. Skipping Christmas wasn't something I took lightly. It's a big deal in my husband's family, a time for everyone to come together, exchange gifts, and celebrate. My mother-in-law put so much effort into making it special, and I hated the thought of letting her down. I also worried about how it would look if we didn't show up. Would it create even more tension between us and the rest of the family? But no matter how much I tried to rationalize going, I couldn't shake the unease. The thought of Bobby holding my daughter again, without my permission, made my stomach turn. I knew I wouldn't be able to relax for a single moment, constantly on guard to make sure she wasn't taken from me. The stress alone would ruin the day, not just for me, but likely for my husband as well. I tried to imagine different scenarios. Maybe we could visit briefly, or set clear boundaries beforehand. But even then, I wasn't sure I could trust Bobby to respect those boundaries, or the rest of the family to back me up if he didn't. The closer Christmas got, the more I realized that no amount of planning or compromise could guarantee the sense of safety I needed. At that point, the question became less about whether we should go and more about whether I was willing to put my daughter and myself in that kind of environment again. As the days passed, I couldn't stop questioning Bobby's intentions. The incident during Thanksgiving haunted me, replaying in my mind over and over. Part of me wanted to believe it was just a thoughtless act, a moment of poor judgment from someone who didn't know any better. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. Bobby's history with me made it hard to give him the benefit of the doubt. His snide email about the vaccines, the months of passive-aggressive behavior, the pointed looks at family gatherings. It all painted a picture of someone who held a grudge. His actions that day didn't feel like the well-meaning mistake my sister-in-law had suggested. Instead, they felt deliberate, as though he were trying to assert some kind of dominance or control. What bothered me the most was how calculated it seemed in hindsight. He didn't ask to hold my baby or even make a casual comment about wanting a turn. Instead, he waited until no one else was looking and then grabbed her without warning. It was such a sudden, jarring action that I couldn't believe it was done with good intentions. The fact that he handed her back only when it became inconvenient for him, when she needed a diaper change, just added to my suspicions. I tried to explain this to my husband, who understood where I was coming from but was hesitant to jump to conclusions. "Maybe he just doesn't realize how upsetting that was," he said, trying to offer a more charitable perspective. But to me, it wasn't about giving Bobby the benefit of the doubt. It was about protecting my daughter from someone who clearly didn't respect me as her mother. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Bobby's actions weren't just careless. They were intentional. Whether it was a power play, a way to undermine me, or simply his way of getting back at me for past grievances, I didn't know. But one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore the possibility that he'd do it again, and that alone was reason enough to draw a firm line. Reflecting on what happened, I realized the core of my frustration wasn't just Bobby's actions. It was the blatant disregard for boundaries. As a new mom, I've learned just how important it is to set clear limits, especially when it comes to protecting my baby. Bobby's decision to grab her without permission wasn't just a physical act. It was a direct challenge to my role as her mother. Boundaries are essential in any healthy relationship, but they become even more critical when children are involved. As parents, my husband and I are responsible for making decisions about who interacts with our child and how. Bobby didn't just overstep. He bulldozed past that line without a second thought. The message it sent was clear. He didn't think my boundaries mattered. What made it worse was the family's response, or lack thereof. I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was more focused on avoiding conflict than addressing the real issue. By downplaying Bobby's behavior, they were essentially telling me that my discomfort was less important than his feelings. That realization was devastating. How could I trust them to respect my role as a parent if they wouldn't even acknowledge that a boundary had been crossed? I also started thinking about the example this sets for my daughter. If I let this slide, what kind of message would I be sending her about self-respect and standing up for herself? I want her to grow up knowing that her feelings and boundaries are valid, no matter who challenges them. That starts with me modeling those values now. Ultimately, this wasn't just about one incident. It was about the principle of respect. Respect for me as a parent, for my decisions, and for the boundaries I've set to protect my child. Without that, I knew something had to change. As I reflected on everything that had happened, my thoughts kept circling back to my mother-in-law. She's always been someone I admire. Warm, supportive, and genuinely kind. Throughout my pregnancy, she was a huge help, offering advice, checking in regularly, and even helping us prepare the nursery. That made it even harder to reconcile her response to the Bobby situation. In many ways, I felt like she was stuck in the middle. She clearly wanted to keep the peace, balancing her relationship with me and my husband with her marriage to Bobby. I could understand that, but at the same time, her unwillingness to take a firmer stance left me feeling let down. She said she understood why we were upset, but her actions, or lack thereof, didn't reflect that understanding. After the vaccine email debacle, I'd hoped she would start holding Bobby accountable for his behavior. Instead, she seemed more focused on smoothing things over and avoiding confrontation. It was the same pattern I'd seen before, excusing his actions as a result of his age, health, or personality quirks. But this time, it wasn't just an awkward comment or an annoying habit. This was about my baby's safety and my role as her mother, and I needed more than vague reassurances. I wrestled with how to approach her. On one hand, I didn't want to damage the positive aspects of our relationship. I truly believe she cares about me and my family, and I didn't want this to become a wedge between us. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore the fact that her continued enabling of Bobby's behavior was part of the problem. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about her and Bobby. It was about the kind of dynamic I wanted to create for my family moving forward. If my boundaries weren't respected here, how could I trust they'd be respected in the future? That realization made it clear. I needed to have an honest conversation with her, even if it meant risking some temporary discomfort. The more I unpacked everything that had happened, the more I started to see patterns in the family dynamics. This wasn't just about Bobby or even my mother-in-law. It was about a culture within the family where certain behaviors were tolerated, excused, or ignored for the sake of maintaining harmony. It had always bothered me, but now that I had a baby to protect, it felt impossible to ignore. Bobby was the clearest example of this dynamic. Over the years, his boundary-pushing behavior had been met with excuses instead of accountability. Whether it was his age, his health, or his personality, there was always a reason not to confront him. I understood that conflict can be uncomfortable, but at what cost? Each time his actions were dismissed, it reinforced the idea that his feelings were more important than anyone else's. But it wasn't just Bobby. I started noticing how this pattern played out in other ways too. The family seemed to prioritize keeping the peace over addressing underlying issues, even if it meant some people had to bite their tongues or swallow their discomfort. It wasn't malicious. It was just how they operated. And for a long time, I'd gone along with it, telling myself it was easier to let things slide than to make waves. Now, though, that wasn't an option. As a mother, I couldn't afford to downplay or dismiss behavior that crossed boundaries. My child's safety and my own sense of security had to come first, even if it disrupted the family's status quo. This realization was empowering, but also daunting. Changing these dynamics wasn't going to be easy, and I knew it might create tension. Still, I was determined to stand my ground. If nothing else, this situation had taught me that some things are too important to compromise. In the days following the incident, I couldn't stop questioning myself. Was I overreacting? Was I being too sensitive? These thoughts swirled in my mind, fueled by the responses I'd received from Bobby's defenders in the family. It seemed like everyone else was willing to dismiss what happened as a misunderstanding or an innocent mistake. Why couldn't I? Part of me felt guilty for even considering skipping family gatherings. My mother-in-law had been so kind and supportive during my pregnancy, and I knew she'd be hurt if we didn't show up for Christmas. I also felt guilty for putting my husband in this position, torn between his family and his role as my partner and our daughter's protector. The last thing I wanted was to cause division or make things harder for him. But every time I started to second-guess myself, I thought about how I felt in that moment when Bobby grabbed my baby. The shock, the helplessness, the overwhelming sense that my boundaries had been completely disregarded. It wasn't something I could simply brush off. And the more I tried to convince myself to let it go, the more it felt like I was betraying my instincts as a mother. I also started to recognize a pattern in my own thinking. For years, I'd downplayed my discomfort to avoid conflict, telling myself that I was just being sensitive. But this wasn't about me anymore. It was about my daughter, and the stakes were much higher now. If I ignored my feelings and allowed the situation to go unaddressed, what kind of message would I be sending her? That her mom didn't stand up for her? That her safety and comfort weren't a priority? These realizations were hard to face, but they were also clarifying. I wasn't being too sensitive. I wasn't overreacting. I was protecting my child, and that was my job. The guilt didn't disappear completely, but it started to take a back seat to something more important. The confidence that I was doing the right thing for my family. Feeling stuck and unsure, I decided to turn to the internet for advice. I've always been a fan of reading forums like AIDA, where people share their dilemmas and get input from strangers. It felt like the perfect place to get an unbiased perspective, especially since I was starting to feel like no one in the family truly understood where I was coming from. I shared my story, detailing everything from the vaccine email to Bobby's behavior at Thanksgiving. I tried to be as balanced as possible, explaining the family dynamics and how much I appreciated my mother-in-law's support in other areas. At the same time, I made it clear how blindsided I felt by the baby snatching incident and how the family's excuses for Bobby were adding to my frustration. The responses came flooding in, and honestly, it was a relief to feel heard. Most people agreed that Bobby had crossed a serious line and that my feelings were valid. They pointed out that boundaries are crucial, especially as a new parent, and that my instincts to protect my daughter were spot on. Some even shared similar stories, which made me feel less alone in my struggle. Of course, there were a few dissenting opinions. A handful of people suggested that Bobby's actions might have been well-intentioned, and that I should consider talking to him directly instead of cutting off family gatherings. While I appreciated the perspective, it only reinforced how difficult this situation was. Confronting Bobby felt like an impossible task, given his history of dismissive and passive-aggressive behavior. Overall, reading through the feedback gave me a sense of clarity. It wasn't just about whether I was justified in my feelings. It was about trusting my instincts and taking action to ensure my family's comfort and safety. The internet reminded me that I wasn't alone, and that standing firm on my boundaries wasn't just reasonable, it was necessary. Throughout this entire ordeal, one thing has been constant: my husband's unwavering support. From the moment I told him about Bobby grabbing our baby, he's been just as angry and concerned as I am. But I can also see how much this situation is weighing on him in a different way. For my husband, this isn't just about Bobby's behavior or our daughter's safety, it's also about his family. He's close to his mom, and their bond has always been important to him. I know he values the time we spend with her, especially during the holidays. And I can tell how much it hurts him to see this conflict disrupting what should be a joyful time. At the same time, he's fiercely protective of me and our daughter. He hasn't hesitated for a second to take my side, even when it means confronting his own family. The text he sent to his mom after Thanksgiving wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment reaction, it was a clear message that he wouldn't tolerate anyone making me feel unsafe or disrespected. That kind of loyalty has been such a comfort to me in the midst of all this chaos. Still, I can see the strain it's putting on him. He's torn between his role as a son and his role as a husband and father, and I know how hard it is for him to reconcile the two. He's tried to be the mediator, encouraging me to trust his mom's ability to handle the situation, while also acknowledging my right to step back if I need to. We've had long, honest conversations about how to move forward. He's made it clear that he'll support whatever decision I make, even if it means skipping family gatherings for the foreseeable future. But I can tell how much he wishes things could go back to normal, where we didn't have to worry about boundaries being crossed or feelings being hurt. His perspective has helped me stay grounded. It's a reminder that this situation isn't just hard for me, it's hard for both of us. But knowing we're in it together makes all the difference. As I wrestled with the decision about whether to return to my in-laws' home, I couldn't stop thinking about my daughter. She's only 3 months old now, far too young to understand what's going on. But this isn't just about the present. It's about the kind of environment I want to create for her as she grows up. Every decision I make now feels like it has long-term implications. How will my daughter view me as a mother? What kind of lessons will she learn from the way I handle situations like this? If I don't stand firm on boundaries now, what message am I sending her about her own right to feel safe and respected? I thought about the values I want to instill in her: confidence, self-respect, and the knowledge that her feelings matter. To me, that means modeling those values in my own behavior. I want her to see that it's okay to speak up when someone crosses a line, even if it's uncomfortable or creates conflict. At the same time, I don't want her to grow up thinking family relationships are disposable. It's a delicate balance, and one I feel the weight of every day. I also thought about how this dynamic might evolve as she gets older. If Bobby's behavior isn't addressed now, what's to stop him from crossing other boundaries in the future? The idea of my daughter growing up in an environment where her autonomy isn't respected is unacceptable to me. I have to set the tone now, even if it means making tough decisions. Ultimately, this isn't just about protecting her physically. It's about creating a foundation of trust and security. I want her to know, without a doubt, that her parents will always stand up for her, no matter what. Feeling stuck and unsure of how to proceed, I turned to some close friends for advice. I needed perspectives from people who weren't part of the family and who could offer an objective view on the situation. While the internet had given me some clarity, I craved a more personal, nuanced discussion with people who knew me and my values. When I recounted the baby snatching incident and the family's response, my friends were unanimously supportive of my feelings. They couldn't believe Bobby had acted so brazenly and were just as stunned by the family's tendency to excuse his behavior. "You're not overreacting," one friend told me firmly. "If someone took my baby like that, I'd have lost it." Still, opinions varied on how I should handle things moving forward. One friend suggested I avoid the family gatherings altogether until Bobby could acknowledge what he'd done and show he respected my boundaries. "You don't owe anyone your presence," she said. "Your priority is your daughter's safety, not their comfort." That perspective resonated deeply with me. Another friend, however, thought I should give Bobby the benefit of the doubt. She suggested having a direct conversation with him, explaining how his actions made me feel, and setting clear expectations for the future. "Sometimes people just don't realize they've crossed a line," she said. "Maybe if you tell him how serious this is for you, he'll get it." While I appreciated the advice, the thought of confronting Bobby made my stomach turn. His track record with me suggested he wasn't someone who responded well to criticism, and I doubted he'd take me seriously. Still, the idea of giving him one last chance to respect my boundaries was tempting, if only to prove to myself that I'd done everything I could. These conversations gave me a lot to think about. I didn't leave with a definitive plan, but I did feel more confident in my right to prioritize my daughter and myself, whether that meant avoiding family events, confronting Bobby, or something in between. I knew I wasn't alone in this. My feelings were valid, and I had the right to act on them. As I continued to reflect on the situation, I couldn't ignore the role my mother-in-law was playing, or not playing, in all of this. While she had always been warm and supportive in other aspects of our relationship, her reluctance to address Bobby's behavior directly was becoming a serious sticking point. It felt like she was walking a fine line, trying to keep the peace while avoiding the harder conversations that needed to happen. When I thought back to her response after Thanksgiving, it frustrated me even more. She'd said she understood why we were upset and promised to talk to Bobby, but I never got the sense that she truly grasped the depth of what I was feeling. Worse, her approach seemed to focus more on minimizing conflict than on actually solving the problem. It was as if she wanted to smooth things over quickly so we could all move on without any real accountability. This wasn't the first time I'd seen her excuse Bobby's actions either. During the vaccine email incident, she had asked us to forgive him because of his health struggles, chalking his outburst up to his medication. While I could empathize with her concern for her husband, it didn't make his behavior any less inappropriate. Each time she defended or dismissed Bobby's actions, it felt like another blow to my confidence that this issue would ever truly be resolved. I found myself wondering, is she enabling Bobby? By constantly making excuses for him and focusing on keeping the family dynamic intact, was she inadvertently encouraging his behavior? The thought was unsettling, especially because I knew she valued our relationship and genuinely cared about her granddaughter. But at the end of the day, her inability or unwillingness to take a firm stand left me feeling unsupported and increasingly isolated. If I couldn't count on her to enforce boundaries now, what did that mean for the future? After weeks of reflection, conversations, and emotional turmoil, I realized I couldn't keep living in this limbo. Something had to change. I couldn't keep subjecting myself, or my daughter, to an environment where boundaries were so blatantly ignored. It wasn't just about Bobby anymore. It was about making it clear to everyone that I was serious about protecting my family. It became obvious that I needed to set a firm boundary. For too long, I'd been bending over backward to avoid conflict, convincing myself that keeping the peace was more important than addressing the root of the issue. But now, I saw that my silence had only enabled the behavior I was trying to avoid. If I wanted things to change, I needed to be the one to draw the line. I sat down with my husband to discuss what this would look like. He was supportive as always, but I could see how much it pained him to think about taking a stand against his own family. Still, he agreed that our daughter's safety and our own peace of mind had to come first. Together, we decided that unless we could be absolutely certain our boundaries would be respected, we wouldn't attend any family gatherings at his mom's house. It was a difficult decision, but it felt like the right one. We drafted a message to his mom, explaining our stance. It wasn't accusatory or emotional. It was simply a statement of fact. We let her know that while we valued our relationship with her, we couldn't put ourselves in a situation where our boundaries weren't upheld. If Bobby's behavior could be addressed and steps taken to ensure it wouldn't happen again, we'd be open to reconsidering. Until then, we needed to step back. Sending that message felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control and clarity. I didn't know how the family would react, but I was certain of one thing. I was finally standing up for myself and my daughter in a way that felt strong and unwavering. The response to our message came quickly, and as expected, it was mixed. My mother-in-law replied first, expressing her disappointment, but also saying she understood where we were coming from. She assured us she would talk to Bobby and try to address the situation, but her tone was careful, almost like she was trying to walk the line between validating our concerns and protecting her husband. It was hard to tell if she truly intended to make changes, or if this was just another attempt to smooth things over without rocking the boat. Bobby, on the other hand, didn't respond directly, but we heard through my sister-in-law that he was upset. She said he felt like we were blowing things out of proportion and making him out to be the bad guy. Her words only reinforced my decision. If Bobby couldn't even acknowledge the impact of his actions, how could we trust him to respect our boundaries moving forward? Other family members started weighing in too. Some were supportive, telling us they understood why we felt the need to take a step back. Others seemed less sympathetic, hinting that we were being overly dramatic or letting one incident ruin everything. It hurt to hear those things, but I reminded myself that they hadn't been in my shoes. They didn't know what it felt like to have someone disregard your boundaries as a parent, or to feel unsafe in a space that was supposed to be welcoming. As difficult as the backlash was, it also solidified my resolve. This wasn't about pleasing everyone or avoiding hurt feelings. It was about protecting my daughter and setting a precedent for how I expected to be treated. No amount of guilt-tripping or criticism could make me question that. For the first time in a long time, I felt certain I was doing the right thing. As I reflected on everything that had happened, one theme kept emerging: the importance of boundaries. I'd always understood their value in theory, but this situation taught me just how critical they are in practice, especially as a parent. Boundaries aren't just a tool for managing relationships. They're a declaration of what you will and won't tolerate, a way to protect what matters most. In the past, I'd often second-guessed myself when it came to setting boundaries. I worried about being seen as difficult or overreacting, and I'd frequently compromised to keep the peace. But becoming a mother changed everything. It clarified my priorities and gave me the courage to stand firm, even when it meant risking conflict or criticism. My daughter's safety and well-being were non-negotiable, and I realized that protecting her also meant respecting my own instincts. This situation also highlighted how much resistance people can have to boundaries, especially when they're used to things being a certain way. Bobby's actions were the most obvious example of this, but the family's broader reaction reinforced it too. Their tendency to excuse his behavior or minimize my feelings showed me how ingrained these patterns were. It wasn't just about Bobby. It was about a dynamic where boundaries weren't respected and accountability was avoided. Setting boundaries wasn't easy. It required difficult conversations, a willingness to face backlash, and a lot of emotional labor. But it also brought a sense of empowerment and clarity. For the first time, I felt like I was truly advocating for myself and my family, creating a space where we could feel safe and respected. This experience taught me that boundaries aren't selfish. They're essential. They're not about punishing others, but about protecting what matters most. And while they may be uncomfortable to enforce, the peace of mind they bring is worth every difficult moment. I now understand that standing firm on boundaries isn't just a choice, it's an act of love. For myself, for my daughter, and for the life we're building together. Looking back on everything, I've come to realize that this situation was about much more than a single incident. It was a turning point for me as a mother, a wife, and an individual learning to navigate the complexities of family dynamics. At its core, it was a lesson in trusting my instincts, standing firm in my decisions, and prioritizing what truly matters: the safety and well-being of my daughter. I've learned that it's okay to draw lines, even when it's uncomfortable. It's okay to demand respect for your role as a parent and to protect your family, even if it means disrupting the status quo. For years, I'd been conditioned to avoid conflict, to brush off discomfort for the sake of keeping the peace. But this experience taught me that peace built on ignored boundaries isn't real peace. It's a fragile illusion that comes at too high a cost. I've also come to appreciate the importance of support, both within my marriage and from others who understood my perspective. My husband's unwavering loyalty reminded me that I'm not alone in this, and the encouragement I received from friends and even strangers online helped me feel validated in ways I didn't expect. As for the future, I know there will be more challenges ahead. Family dynamics are rarely simple, and navigating them will always require a balance of compassion, firmness, and self-awareness. But I feel more prepared now, more confident in my ability to handle whatever comes next. At the end of the day, I don't regret the decisions I've made. They weren't easy, but they were necessary. My hope is that by standing up for myself and my daughter, I've set a foundation for a stronger, healthier family dynamic, and shown her that she, too, has the right to protect her boundaries and prioritize her own well-being.